This is a series that we've put together that features experts from American University and a lot of invited guests to come and talk to us about some of the challenges in academia for the 21st century, particularly those that libraries encounter, although we keep our scholars in mind as well. So we look at issues that confront the scholars and the institutions and some of the complexities that come to us at a time when publishing in high-impact journals is competing to some extent with open access, and libraries live at the juncture of both of those, as do the scholars of our communities. Today we're delighted to welcome to American University Kevin Smith, who's the director of the Office of Copyright and Scholarly Communications at Duke University, and he's going to talk to us about copyright law and pose some questions, and he has already urged us to challenge him when he makes broad statements. As technologies change and as Congress considers a revision of the copyright law, what is the role of academic authors in this discussion? How can we get a seat at the table? And once we get that seat, what do we advocate for? As director of the Office of Copyright and Scholarly Communications, his principal role is to teach and to advise faculty, administrators, and students about copyright, intellectual property licensing, and scholarly publishing. Kevin holds a master's in library science from Kent State University and has worked as an academic librarian in both liberal arts colleges and specialized research libraries. He's also an attorney with a JD from Capital University Law School, and he holds bar admission in the Ohio and North Carolina state bars. Welcome to this podium.
Well, good morning. Yes, I've been whining to people all morning that to get here I've been up since 3 in the morning. So if I nod off in the middle of my own talk, well, at least you won't feel bad. So I'm really pleased to come and address this question: does copyright still matter for academic authors? And if so, why? You notice I said why, not why or why not. It should be pretty obvious that I'm going to answer the question in the affirmative. Answering this question with a yes is both a professional and a personal commitment. I wouldn't have a job if copyright didn't matter for academic authors. But believing that copyright still matters for academic authors is not the same as saying that it is working well as it currently stands. So I will, I hope, assuming I stay on task and don't nod off, I will have a couple of fairly general principles at the end of my talk about what we should be looking for in a copyright revision. So if Congress really does undertake copyright reform, I think it's important that they recognize the hugely diverse universe of authors that have been empowered, if you will, since the adoption of the 1976 Copyright Act. You know, before that, before January 1st, 1978, which is when the 76 Act took effect, before that, a work only had copyright when it was published with copyright notice. Now that meant that copyrighted works were almost exclusively those written by and published by authors who had a commercial incentive, although of course academic authors were still publishing their work. Copyright is very clearly written to create that commercial incentive. But we do need to remember that it begins with this statement of public purpose. The purpose of copyright law, according to the Constitution, is to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. And it is the only power given to Congress. Article 1, Section 8 is a list of the powers given to Congress to pass legislation. So that's where they get the authority to regulate interstate commerce, to impose taxes, to create a standing army. All of those things are powers that Congress is explicitly given in the Constitution, and without a power in the Constitution, Congress can't do something. So one of the provisions is the provision that allows them to adopt copyright law. It is the only one that has this statement of purpose. Congress is not told why it can impose taxes, although the answer is pretty obvious, or why it can regulate interstate commerce. It is told why copyright law. In fact, the provision doesn't even say. It doesn't begin with Congress has the power to create a standing army, to impose taxes, to regulate interstate commerce, to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. The power itself that is given to Congress is to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. And then the clause goes on and says, by securing to authors and inventors the exclusive rights in their respective writings and discoveries for a limited time. I'm paraphrasing. So it's really important to notice that the public interest is at the root of this economic incentive. Right? The economic incentive is so that authors will be able to make a living. That's what exclusive rights do. They force prices up. They're monopolies. So that authors will be able to make a living and will continue to write. And inventors will continue to invent, and painters and musicians will continue to paint and compose. But the reason is to benefit the general public. The reason is so that we have an ever-increasing stock of knowledge and culture. And when you think about it, that is exactly what scholarship does. So if copyright is going to work, it should work for the interests of scholars at least as well as the commercial authors, the J.K. Rowlings of the world, who want to make money from their books. They deserve to make money from their books. I'm fine with that. But academic authors are one of the largest groups of authors out there. And by the way, now, of course, we have a whole lot of casual authors, amateur authors, if you will, fan fiction, blogs, all kinds of things that are being created well outside the definition of authorship that was imagined even in the 1976 law. So if we're going to reform copyright law, we need to recognize this diversity, take account of the different needs and the different incentives of all these different kinds of authors. In other words, we need a really, really flexible copyright law. One probably with more exceptions and limitations, not fewer. More authorial choice. Right now, you can only choose to get copyright. Copyright is automatic. You can't do anything to not get it. In 1976 or 1975, you could. You could publish your work without notice, and you wouldn't have a copyright. You would be essentially dedicating your work to the public domain. You don't have that choice anymore unless you actively take the step of imposing a Creative Commons license or something like that. We need to graduate the penalties in copyright law. The penalties in copyright law assume that there's a major source of profit that has been undermined by an act of infringement. Most of the time that is not the case. The penalties in copyright law are built into the law, $150,000 per act of infringement. They're built into the law. They are very draconian. They are, of course, they work very well for that threatening thing that you see at the beginning of a DVD, right? Which is arguably what they were written for. But we need to be much more flexible in how we consider remedies. I've just given my whole talk on my first slide. This happens. I'm sorry about that. No, I haven't really. But the point here is simply to say that the interests of academic authors need to be taken into account, and those interests would drive a rather different looking copyright law than what we currently have. Two recent developments, the good news and the bad news. The good news is that in this digital age, our courts have rediscovered the importance of scholarship and libraries. And it's really interesting to see how important libraries have been in some of the most recent fair use and copyright jurisprudence. And by the way, later today, 5:30, 6 o'clock, Judge Pierre Laval is speaking at the George Washington College of Law of American University. Judge Laval is our foremost authority on copyright and fair use. He wrote the article in 1990 that influenced the Supreme Court when they made their landmark ruling on fair use in the Oh Pretty Woman case, Campbell versus Acuff Rose Music. They cited his article many, many times, which is the gold standard for a legal academic. And then 4 weeks ago, he wrote the decision in the Google Books case. So he is easily the most influential figure in making the law of fair use right now. So by all means, go hear him. In fact, if you only have an hour, get up and leave now, because you should hear Judge Lavelle. I can't, which drives me crazy. I have to fly back today. Anyway, so I keep interrupting myself. It happens a lot. In any case, courts have rediscovered how important scholarship and libraries are. They have been crafting a fair use analysis that is very, very flexible and adapted to the digital age, which is just wonderful to see. The central role of libraries in the Hathi Trust case, in the Google Books case, in the Georgia State case, and even in the Kirtzong case, the case about the doctrine of first sale that the Supreme Court decided 3 or 4 years ago, where even though the plaintiffs were textbook publishers, the defendant was this man who was selling textbooks that were purchased overseas, shipped to the United States, and sold for a higher price but less than the US price. Libraries were not involved in that case at all, but the briefs that the library organizations submitted and the concerns of libraries were cited over and over again in the decision, as they were in these other cases that did involve libraries and universities. These decisions put a heavy emphasis on the purpose of copyright. I started with that constitutional mandate about copyright because that's where the courts have been starting. They've been looking at, are we actually serving this public interest purpose, especially when they've been deciding fair use cases. So my theme here is courts like us in libraries. They like scholarship. They recognize its importance. They are adapting fair use in ways that recognize that importance, and if you can possibly go hear Judge Lavelle, do so. The bad news. Among other things that are floating around in the world of copyright reform is a proposal to move the Copyright Office out of the Library of Congress. And it's interesting to me because it's timed just at the moment when we're seeing this renewed emphasis on the importance of libraries in copyright law. So it seems like exactly the wrong time, although one could argue, if one were cynical enough, that that's exactly the purpose. And some of the rhetoric we've seen is that there's a conflict of interest between the Copyright Office and the Library of Congress. And I think that's a very strange view of what copyright law is about. There are, I think, 3 narratives to explain why this proposal is out there. The explanation that you'll see if you read it's called a discussion draft, but it looks like a bill. If you read that, the explanation you'll see is that it will give the Copyright Office more independence and a better infrastructure, which is interesting, of course. One thing that it doesn't do is tell us how much that would cost. But that's sort of the standard explanation, independence and infrastructure. The cynical explanation, I think, or a cynical explanation, is that the proposal is about power in a city where real power and the appearance of power are so important. It may very well have to do with at least the appearance of power. The really cynical explanation is that moving the Copyright Office out of the Library of Congress facilitates the process that's known as regulatory capture. That is, where the industries that are supposed to be regulated by an agency become the people who are calling the shots for that agency. We already have pretty much a revolving door between the traditional content industries and the Copyright Office. A lot of the major employees of the Copyright Office have come from the ranks of lobbyists or lawyers for the content industry and go back to those roles. They have a legitimate interest in copyright, obviously, but I've just tried to argue with you that theirs is not the only interest, that the needs of libraries should be taken into account. And then there's one more point. If the problem is infrastructure and the unresponsiveness of the Librarian of Congress, which is frequently cited, why not wait for a new Librarian of Congress and see if the problems that are sometimes cited can be fixed? Anyway, I think that's one of the downside recent developments in copyright. I'm now going to veer away and talk more about copyright and scholarship. And specifically at the moment, copyright and open access. I think one of the fundamental reasons that scholars embrace open access, some do, some don't, is that copyright as it currently works in the academy misdirects the economic incentive. Right? The author makes money, so the author continues to write. Well, our current system is the author gives away her work. She's not paid for it. The reward comes someplace else. It comes from the institution that employs her. She gets tenure, she gets a promotion, she gets grants. All of those things are rewards for being a good and productive scholar, but they are outside of the economic incentive that copyright is supposed to create. So why? This was supposed to be animated so you wouldn't see the answer to my question. Why do we need copyright in academia? Why does it still matter? And I think the answer is control. Copyright gives an author control. And the reason that I think it's important for us to see more flexibility and more recognition of the diversity of authorship in copyright is so that that control works better for that wide variety of authors I was talking about. So one of the goals of the open access movement is to put control over important decisions about use and reuse into the hands of scholars, into the hands of people who are best able to decide what is good for them, for their students, for their colleagues, and for their discipline. A big question here is who should have the right to explore new opportunities, new business models, new ways of funding scholarship? Should it be the scholars or should it be the publishers? And we're seeing that debate in almost every new technological development, where publishers argue as the copyright holders, we should be the ones who make these decisions. We should have the right to exploit or not exploit a particular opportunity. Whereas I'm arguing that for scholarly authors at least, leaving that control in the hands of those scholarly authors is probably the best way to go. By the way, in the Google, just to give you an example, in the Google Books case that Judge Lavelle, he wrote the opinion for a unanimous three-judge panel about 3 or 4 weeks ago. One of the arguments that the Authors Guild and the authors they were representing made against Google Books is that it usurped their potential licensing market. And the judge for creating digitized indexes of books. But of course, there's no indication that they ever intended to do that or that they had the capacity to do it. And we often say nobody but Google could have done this. So what they were arguing was that the control that we get when we get the transfer of copyright, well, these were actually authors, some of the few lucky authors who hold their own copyright. But the argument was we should be able to decide not only to exploit a particular market, but to shut down a particular, I said market, I should say opportunity. The court rejected that. They said that was looking at this idea of markets and potential markets too broadly. Lingua. Lingua, you know, means tongue, which is why we have this wonderful picture of Albert Einstein. The recent flap about Lingua, you know, the editor and all 32 members of the board have resigned from the journal and gone off to create, it's an Elsevier journal. They could not get Elsevier to agree to some demands, admittedly some demands that they never thought Elsevier would agree to, in my opinion. They resigned, they've gone off to create their own open access journal in linguistics. Of course, Lingua will continue to publish through Elsevier, and we'll probably just find a new board of editors. one of the debates, and it really shows this emphasis on control in the lingua flap. Elsevier, in their statement about the resignation, said, "We founded Lingua 60-some years ago." Well, Lingua was founded by two academics, and it was first published by a house called North Holland Publishing, which, of course, Elsevier bought. So Elsevier acquired Lingua by purchasing it. And when this was pointed out, they say, well, we feel like North Holland is us. But the question here, we purchased them, their culture came to us, was part of their statement. But the scholars who actually founded Lingua are sort of left out of this narrative. And I think it is sort of indicative of this struggle over control and whether or not it should be the academics, the scholars, who of course provide free content. I don't know of any other industry where the content on which the industry is built is provided for free. Imagine how much your car would cost if the steel was provided for free. It would probably be more expensive, which seems to be what happens with with publishing. So anyway, everybody works for free and publishers reap the profits. This is what I mean by the economic incentive being misdirected. So it prompts the question, what does it really cost to publish academic work? It's a black box. It's really, really hard to know. Lingua charges $1,800, the Elsevier version of it before the resignations, probably it will continue this way, charges $1,800 per article. The editors asked for €400, about $430. Elsevier said that was an unsustainable price point for them. Now remember, these are by and large not scientists who are getting NIH or NSF grants. If they're getting grants, their grants are much smaller, and many of them are working on research funds that are provided by their institutions. So it raises this question of what academic publishing costs. Elsevier actually does publish several journals with APCs that are closer to €400 than they are to $1,800. I don't know why those are indifferent. It's just how they came out of the news reports. So the question is, where does the money go? Well, of course, Elsevier has very high overhead. If you've ever been to what I call the Dark Towers of Mordor outside of Amsterdam, I have once, kind of a creepy experience. It's a really luxurious set of double high-rise towers. They report an average profit margin of 36 to 37%, which is higher than the oil industry makes, a higher profit margin than the oil industry, most of the major oil companies make. I think the really interesting point is that many of us have said digital publishing should be cheaper. The marginal costs are almost zero. Well, why isn't it? One of the reasons is because digital to us means put it up on the web, let anybody who wants to see it, see it. Digital publishing to Elsevier means building an infrastructure where they can keep people out. A surprising amount of the money actually goes to building that exclusivity into a network, because exclusivity is not what networks do. It's not what they naturally do. As the technologists at Duke always tell me, when a network encounters a block, it treats it as a bug and looks for a way around it. So I'm looking for a story I want to tell you. Okay, I'm going to tell you that story later. I didn't want to tell it here. So one of the places that this money is going is to building the technology of exclusion. Of course, copyright is itself a legal structure of exclusion. We call it a property right for that reason. All property rights are rights of exclusion. Right? To own a house means nobody else can come in. To own a car means nobody else can drive it. Do you want to ask something? Oh, I'm sorry. Article processing charge. That's when a journal is supported by author-side fees that are very often paid by grant money. So Elsevier charges $1,800 per article for authors who want their article to be made open access. They also charge a subscription for most everybody else. It's a sweet deal. It's not, by the way, the highest APC, and it's about the same these days as what the PLOS journals, the Public Library of Science journals, charge. It's less than what Biomed Central charges for most of its journals. Currently, the highest APC I know of is Nature Communications, which has just become an open access journal, and charges $5,200 per article.
The authors pay that, or their institutions? How does that?
Well, if you ask Nature, they will say, oh, it's all the grant money. You know, they just use their grant money. Authors come to us saying, can you help us pay these fees? Because if we pay this is one less experiment we get to do. Our research suffers. We can't afford $5,200. At Duke, we will help people pay these, but the maximum we'll supply is $2,000. So at this point, I think most Duke authors are not publishing in Nature Communications, although they did. I think it's an example of an open access journal that's priced itself out of the market. And I'm really going to be interested to see if when we renegotiate our deal for the Nature journals, we get an offset for the APCs that are being paid by our faculty, assuming there are some. My suspicion, and I know some people in here negotiate these packages all the time, my suspicion is that what we're going to hear is, in order to offset what we've earned on APCs, we're reducing the amount we're going to raise your costs. I think that's probably what we're actually going to hear. So anyway, if funding is a black box for traditional publishing and even for open access in the hands of the traditional publishers, we do have the opportunity with open access research to do a lot of experiments in how we fund scholars. We were just talking about APCs and the author pays model and who actually pays it. That's actually a minority of open access articles. Actually, it's a minority of open access, of so-called gold open access journals, although it's possible that it's a majority of the open access articles. We don't have a really good way to study that. There are lots of other options. Self-archiving. Duke has an open access policy that says all of our authors will at least consider self-archiving their own work. Memberships. PeerJ is now based on a fairly low membership fee that's supposed to be iterative, so that when you have, I join as an author, I publish a paper, I pay $130 to become a member for life. The next paper I publish, I don't have to pay again, but 6 of my graduate students are authors on this paper, so they each join for $129 for life. And the idea is that this will be a continuous process. So far, it seems to be working. They've been in existence for several years now. I've had a couple of authors say that the publishing experience has been the best of their lives, that it's quicker, that the peer review was really, really good. So it's interesting to see how that works. Institutional or funder support. eLife is now a journal that's funded entirely by funders, by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and the Wellcome Trust. Flipped models. We've seen Scope 3, Knowledge Unlatched. The current Ubiquity Press is trying to encourage journals to flip and publish with them. By flip, I mean no longer charge subscription rates, but find other kinds of funding and make the journals open access. Would libraries, if we could make the transition, would we start spending our money to support the production of knowledge rather than its consumption? The person in the room who really matters is nodding her head back there. So copyright could empower a whole lot of experiments to determine what is the best model. All of these experiments depend on copyright remaining in the control of the scholarly community. This is what we do as scholars. We try things, we experiment, we gather data, sometimes, and we try to make conclusions based on data. Right now, In the closed access or subscription world, it's almost impossible to do that. So one of the things that open access and the control that comes with authors and scholars retaining copyright can facilitate is this experimentation with how we fund scholarship. Now, funding scholarship and cost is not the only reason that control is important. I like this idea of the search for quality scholarship, and I often say impact factor, which is one of the principal ways we evaluate scholars and scholarship these days, always reminds me of that story of the man who was standing on the corner, bent down and looking around, and his friend came up, or a policeman came up and said, "What's the matter, Mac?" And he said, "I lost my wallet." And the policeman said, "Oh, what happened?" "I don't know, I dropped it as I was coming out of that bar down midway down the block." And the policeman said, "Well, why are you looking here?" And the man says, "Well, the light's better here." That's what impact factor is. We've been looking at what we could measure, not what would actually tell us something useful. Right? We're looking where the light is, but not where we have any hope of finding what we're looking for. Impact factor measures the alleged impact of a journal over a 5-year window. It looks at all the citations to articles in those journals, and I don't remember what the denominator is. But it doesn't tell us anything about an individual article. It gives us only a very small slice of information about use. Right? Even if, suppose the individual article published in an impact journal, a journal with an impact factor of 3.6, actually had exactly the same number of citations. So suppose it worked perfectly. We would still not know two things. We would not know, what did those citations say? Did they say this is a piece of crap? Or did they say this is brilliant scholarship? And we wouldn't know what other kinds of impact scholarship might be having. We would know that a small group of scholars in the same field were citing this article. Or we might know that the author, the co-authors are citing this article, because of course that gets counted, and that's why we see citation rings that have been developed to game the system. Citation rates are better, but they still don't tell us much. They tell us about individual articles, but they still don't tell us what's being said, and they don't, just lost my train of thought. They don't tell us what's being said, and they still only reflect that small sliver of academics. In a more open environment, we have a lot more opportunities. And I'm actually almost finished, although I'm going to tell you stories with this slide, so you may have to be patient with me. In a more open environment, we can measure different kinds of impact. As I say, impact factor really doesn't tell us much of anything. Citation rates tell us one very small thing. Other kinds of impact that we can measure in a more open environment: discussions in the news media, use in policy reports, communication to field workers, people who are actually working on specific problems, discussions about impact on real lives, and I'm going to give you illustrations of these. The first one, I think is kind of amusing. About 3 weeks ago, the local newspaper in the Research Triangle, called the Raleigh News and Observer, published an article about research being done at Duke on dog cognition. And it was particularly how to talk to your dog. And if you're interested, the upshot is this: if you have a very, very excitable animal, talk calmly to it. If you have a very sedate animal, get it excited. That's the upshot of the research. Okay, it's the kind of thing that's popular in newspapers. And the Raleigh News Observer is starting to figure out the digital age. So they provided a link to the full article. If you'd like to read more about this path-breaking research in dog cognition, here's the link. And all around the Research Triangle, readers clicked on that link and hit a $40 paywall. $40 to read that one article. I think very few people actually did read it. But it was an example of how this closed research makes impact on the real world, in this case not a particularly earth-shattering topic, harder to accomplish, and then of course harder to measure. By the way, at Duke, my office, Scholarly Communications, has a relationship with the Office of News and Communications. So whenever the Duke News and Communications is going to write a story about research that happens at Duke, we get as much advance notice as News and Communications can give us. Then we go back to the author, we find out what the rules for making their work available in our repository are, and we ask them to send us the appropriate version of their article. At that point, we get almost 100% people sending it back if it's legal. We discovered this over a long period of time. From the time you worked, Jenya, in my office, we discovered this, that if authors know that we're not putting them in a difficult situation where there are legal obstacles, breach of contract, anything like that, they almost never object to open access. And in this context, when we're saying we'll tie an open version of your article to a press release so that later newspapers and journalists who write about your research will actually be able to see it and hopefully get it right. And the feedback we get is that they are seeing better coverage when we make this available. It's kind of labor intensive, but it's a small number of articles. What it does, though, is point out to our faculty one of the benefits of open access at exactly the point that they're really interested in it. So with the dog cognition article, we did the same thing. We wrote, and the professor was happy to give us the author's final manuscript, which is what we could use. We put it in the repository. We blogged about it. I think the Duke News and Communications actually wrote a story about, sort of a meta story about the reporting on this and provided the free link. And then we also sent it on to the News and Observer. I have no idea whether they've used it. And the last time I told this story in a group, somebody went and looked and said, well, they must, because I've gone right to the article. But of course, they were in a university library where they had access anyway. And in fact, they were still going to the Springer version. So I can't tell you whether the News Observer has learned that much from the experience, but we sure have, that this is something that really matters to our authors. Another thing up there is blogging about environmental scholarship. Or no, that's here, is communicating to field workers. And the story I want to tell involves blogging about environmental scholarship, which is in my notes, but you can't see it. He's retired now, but the dean of our School of the Environment, the Nicholas School of the Environment, the dean was a man named Bill Humanities. And Bill was a blogger. He probably still is. If you want to look for the blog, it's called, for an unaccountable reason, at least to me, the Green Grokster. Anyway, one of the things he did was regularly blog about work done by his faculty, published articles from his faculty that he thought could have a significant impact on the way people actually work on environmental issues, on climate control issues, on clean air and clean water, that sort of thing. He would blog about them, and then he would notice the retweeting of his blog, very often by NGOs that were making his reports on the research accessible to field workers who were doing the actual work. So it's a kind of impact that impact factor will never measure for us, but it makes one heck of a lot more difference. Last story. We had an article published recently by one of our researchers on marijuana use, the age of marijuana use, and effect on cognitive ability. And in this particular case, she made the article open access almost immediately. And then we were using these altmetric tools to follow what was being said. And this is one of the advantages of open scholarship and these so-called altmetrics. You can actually follow to the comments. You can go to the blog post, you can see the tweet, you can go to the article, you can go to the government report to see what's actually being said, what use of scholarship is being made. So it's not that we don't know whether it's crap or brilliant. You can actually find out. In this case, she went to and followed some of this, and one of the things she discovered was a discussion forum where her article was being discussed by adolescents about their own marijuana use. And her findings were basically that marijuana use at a fairly young age, in your teens, when your brain is still developing, has a negative impact on cognitive ability later on. That there's a certain age point, and I don't want to tell you what it all is, because I don't want to tell you all what it is, I don't actually know, where it doesn't make much difference after that. And she was seeing teenagers discussing whether or not this worried them, which was really fascinating. And she actually did see some people going, this scares me, I think I'm going to lay off the weed for a while. Really, you talk about research having an impact. In our strategic planning process at Duke, we talk a lot about knowledge in the service of society, engaging the larger community. This is scholarship doing that because it's open. And because it's open, we can watch it happen. So all of this means that one of the things that should, could, and can change in the open access world is how we think about impact and promotion and tenure. We know that it has already been possible to game the system. I talked about the peer review rings and things like that. There's some concern that open peer review might there's concern that open access might increase the ability to game the system. My argument would be that open peer review would actually make it less gameable. That is, we'd be able to see what peer reviewers wrote. There are a lot of proposals out there to do away with double-blind peer review, or if it remains anonymous, to make it more open, so that it's possible to see what the reviewers actually said and how did the scholar respond to what they said. That would give us valuable information. To tell you one more story, I published a book just about a year ago on copyright in higher education. Two things I'm going to tell you about it. The first is it was your normal academic print run of 500 copies. It sold pretty well. I'm pleased, and like all vain scholars, I look in OCLC to see in WorldCat to see how many libraries have cataloged it. I've even compared it to books published roughly the same time by members of the Duke faculty, and I'm doing pretty well, thank you. So I'm happy with the sales, but it was a 500 copy print run. There's also an open access copy available in our repository and on the website of the publisher, because they agreed to that when we negotiated. From Duke's repository alone, the work has been downloaded more than 1,500 times, 3 times more than the total print run. So that's something to be able to introduce. I'm not in the promotion and tenure system, but it would be a wonderful thing to be able to say, okay, let's look at the traditional measures. Let's look at the impact factor of my articles. Let's look at the reputation of my publisher. But let's also look at who's using my book, how much they're using it. Open access gets me a lot more use. So I think promotion and tenure files need to report both things. The other thing I was going to tell you about my book is that it was sent out for review to a number of scholars. One of the best, most helpful reviews I got came from, and I'm going to tell you who, came from the open access advocate at Harvard, Peter Suber. And Peter wrote back to the publisher and said, and I tell this story because I so admire him and his integrity. He said, first of all, I don't know the law of these issues, even though Peter's a lawyer, well enough to review what he has to say about copyright and other intellectual property law. But I do know about open access, so I'm only going to review the 2 chapters that I know something about. Wouldn't it be wonderful if scholars who were asked to review things were that upfront about what, took account of what their expertise is as much as what their time is? So that's the first sort of gesture of integrity from Peter. The second was, he says, when you give this review to the author, and I don't know whether he knew that I was the author or not, we know each other, he said, I want you to tell him who the review came from, because I'm going to recommend that he cite some of my work a little bit more than he does. And of course, that happens in peer review all the time. The difference is Peter was honest enough to say so and to want me to know that the recommendation was coming from him. And I did cite more of his work because he made my work better, which is what peer review is supposed to be about. The last thing I want to say about this is just a gesture towards the digital humanities, because I think that one of the things that is going to generate change in our peer review system, make us look at how we evaluate digital scholarship, make us more flexible, make us less dependent on some of the traditional metrics, is the fact that our scholars are creating things that just don't lend themselves to those traditional metrics. We have faculty working on a website of translations and biographies of women philosophers, many of whom you will have never heard of but should. It's called Project Vox. They're giving a voice. It's a real work of scholarship. It involves research, it involves translation, it involves annotation, it involves biography. It involves creating teaching resources to teach the work of these philosophers. It's not going to result, as far as I know, and I don't know how it would, in a journal article or a book. So when those faculty want to put it into their tenure files, it's going to force a promotion and tenure committee, and by the way, Duke has been pretty good about this over the years, at looking at new ways to evaluate scholarship. And that is something else that open access, which depends on authors retaining the control that is given them by copyright, will facilitate. So why does copyright still matter? I think it's three simple words. Copyright gives control, control creates opportunity. We have tremendous opportunities in the digital realm to rethink how scholarship works. And copyright and retaining copyright for our scholars is essentially a sine qua non, something we cannot do without if we're going to exploit those opportunities. I promised you 3 principles to make copyright better, and I'll end with those. So here are my principles to make copyright better, and they won't surprise you. More flexibility in order to incentivize different kinds of authors and support different business models and different reward structures. That's been most of the theme of the talk that I've given you this morning. Second, to recognize and celebrate the interdependence, I've got to read that word right, the interdependence of copyright law and libraries. We are, if you will, the fulcrum in the copyright balance. Copyright is supposed to be a balance between creators and users. As librarians, we buy the works of creators, that is, except in academic circles, we support the incentive purpose of copyright to encourage creativity. And we make the works available to users in order to give them the building blocks for future creativity. We're the fulcrum in the copyright balance, and we need to recognize that. And then we need to continue to do what our courts have been doing, that is to view fair use as a central element of the flexibility that copyright needs in order to do its job in the digital age. Fair use is not an extra in our copyright law. It is part of the fabric. And we can't take it out and we can't ignore it. For one thing, going back to that constitutional purpose to promote the progress of science and the useful arts, if we diminish the role of fair use and other exceptions that support continuing creativity, our copyright law potentially becomes unconstitutional because it would fail to do what it is that Congress has been told it's empowered to do. So fair use is not a nice thing that makes it a little easier for our users to do some of the things they want to do. It is an inseparable part. It is what makes our copyright law compatible not only with the constitutional provision that authorizes copyright law, but with another important constitutional provision, the right of free expression. I'll stop there and ask you if you have any questions. That's not a question. Thank you, but that's not a question. Yes, sir.
I apologize if I missed that, but you said there was a proposal to move the Copyright Office out of the Library of Congress. Does that include where it would be?
It would be an independent, at least the proposal I've seen, it would be an independent agency. I think there has also been talk about moving it into the Department of Commerce, where the Patent and Trademark Office is. And that, I think, is a really interesting proposal because it really does sort of confuse the constitutional origins. And we've already confused them. Patents are authorized by that same clause that I cited, the promote the progress of science and the useful arts by securing to inventors and authors for a limited time rights in their respective inventions and writings. More or less what it says. Patents are justified as under the inventions part of that clause, copyright under the writings part of that clause. Trademarks, we know from early cases or late 19th century cases, trademarks cannot be justified under the promote the progress of science and the useful arts clause. The courts struck down trademark legislation initially when it was justified that way. So it's justified as a regulation over interstate commerce. So the location of the Patent and Trademark Office in the Commerce Department makes sense for the trademark part of it, less sense for the patent part of it, although you can see it. Almost no sense for the Copyright Office. And the other proposal, I think the more serious one, is that it would be an independent agency. There are issues here of separation of powers. It is true that the Copyright Office is in a rather confused position in the sense that the President appoints the Librarian of Congress who oversees the Copyright Office, at least nominally. But the Copyright Office serves Congress. So one of the arguments is that we would have cleaner lines, although it's not clear how these proposals would appoint a registrar of copyright. So, Nancy.
And one of the points that's been made repeatedly over the years about copyright is that putting it in the Library of Congress puts an executive function into the legislative branch.
Right.
Which lawyers love to argue about. But having looked at that discussion draft, Kevin, does it strip out the benefits to the Library of Congress from copyright deposits?
That is treated in there, and one of the things I think is interesting is that it's basically kicked down the road. It says that there will be a study about mandatory deposit. And you know, one of the fictions, one of the horror stories that we sometimes hear is that mandatory deposit is a threat to the market for publishers. I'm sorry, what was that? No. I could read lips, but you all couldn't see it. Is a threat to publishers' markets because of this fear. And you find it in the content industries a lot, that the ultimate goal of libraries is to digitize everything and make it free to everyone. Do you all have the money to do that? Any of your libraries? Raise your hands. Viva, you have that kind of money, right? You're going to digitize all the books in the state of, you know, Google Books has done a lot of that, and they're the only entity that could, and they have done it in a way that respects copyright law. So this horror narrative is a fiction, I think, but it's sometimes used to justify the concern that maybe we should put an end to mandatory deposit. Yeah, Jenya.
Speaking of mass digitization, could you talk a little bit about what the response you would have to the report that they published on open works and mass digitization? The Copyright Office did back in June. And
Right.
there was a response for comment, but it was pretty bizarre.
The proposal or the responses or all of the above? The proposal was this extended collective licensing scheme, which I agree with you, I find rather bizarre. I think from the tenor of my remarks this morning, you can probably figure out that my answer would be that fair use actually works pretty well, and that in the Hathi Trust and Google Books cases, the courts pretty clearly told us that fair use could work pretty well for mass digitization. So I think that it's probably unnecessary to add extended collective licensing. Extended collective licensing means that there would be an agency Once you would determine that a work was an orphan work, and it's not clear how you make that determination, you could pay for a license to this collective organization and be allowed to go ahead with the digitization of these orphan works. The collective rights organization would take your money and they would try to find a rights holder. Now, if you've established that it's an orphan work, you've already done that work, so it would be duplicative. And then if they can't find a rights holder, then the money just goes into a pot that would support the collective rights organization and or be distributed to other artists of the same type. One thing we know about collective rights organizations around the world is that they are rife with corruption, that smaller and smaller amounts are actually distributed to authors, but they're very good at building expensive bureaucracies. And in this case, virtually by definition, the copyright incentive would not work because the money wouldn't go to the creators if they're genuine orphan works, because the orphan works are works where you can't find the creator. So basically, to me, the proposals amount to, I'm going to sell your car. You know, I haven't seen you drive it for a couple of days, Jenya. I'm going to sell your car. You know, I think you've abandoned it, and you know. That would not work with other kinds of property laws. So why it should be allowed to work for an organization to reap an economic benefit, whereas the Bible says it did not so. I don't know why we would allow that. Yeah, back there she had her hand up before.
Could you discuss the impact of the institutional repositories on copyright considerations for academia, and also any particular implications that they might have for selling communications personally?
Well, I think that in a way that's what I have been talking about, in the sense that institutional repositories facilitate open access to a wide variety of scholarship. They provide the seed ground for a lot of the things that I've been talking about new ways of thinking about how we evaluate work, new ways of thinking about what it costs to produce a work, more open peer review. All of those things are possible. You know, Archive is the physics preprint repository, which now houses lots of postprints and all kinds of different versions of articles, has really been, I think, a proving ground for various kinds of open peer review, because it is possible to continue to comment on things both before they've been formally published and after. So I think the implication is that repositories are one of a variety of ways in which we can create the environment that I've been talking about. Yeah.
I'm not a librarian, and from a faculty
Sorry about that. You know.
All right. So from a faculty standpoint, working with students doing research, how does the Google Books decision affect us? Like, can we assign them to read something out of Google Books, or does that interfere with fair use? Like, how does that work?
Well,
exactly?
technologically, they can't read things in Google Books that are under copyright. What Google Books facilitates is searching, full text word searching, so that you can search a word, you see it in context, that's what the snippets are. You see it in a 3-line context. The idea being that it makes it easier for you to evaluate whether or not it's actually talking about your topic in a way that's helpful to you, or if it's just a casual mention. But then you still have to go to your library and get the book. Now, if it's in the public domain, then yes, you absolutely can. Or if it's been opened by a publisher, and many books have. Duke University Press has worked with Google to open up access through the Hathi Trust. The Hathi Trust received most of the digital scans and keep them for preservation purposes, but they also make open access works available. You can certainly assign those books.
Or the second part too, if the with open access, is it going to become more difficult for our students to determine peer-reviewed from non-peer-reviewed? Is it going to become like this kind of whack-a-mole thing? Like right now, we can say, okay, go into the databases and click on the peer-reviewed button, and a lot of what you get will be peer-reviewed. But since some of these open access journals don't seem like they're cooperating with the databases because that's the income stream, et cetera.
Right.
So now they're gonna be back on Google Scholar or doing Google searches. Are we gonna be running into a more difficult time teaching them to tease this
Right,
out?
right. Well,
Curating this.
there are a bunch of answers to that. One is they probably are actually using Google Scholar already, and all of our research suggests that they are. Remember, a lot of what's in repositories has been peer reviewed. That is, they're very often versions of articles that have been peer reviewed and published in all the traditional journals. Also, lots and lots of open access journals are peer reviewed. We host 4 at Duke, they're all peer reviewed. So in one sense, no, I think that's not the case. Of course, there's a whole lot of stuff on the web that is not peer reviewed. So, you know, in the sense that it's just part of the booming, buzzing confusion that is the web, I think it's true that it is harder to distinguish the quality of scholarship or what the markers are of quality scholarship on the web. But open access, I don't think, is making that problem worse, except insofar as it makes more research more easily available. Secondly, of course, peer review has always been problematic long before open access. Right? As a scholar, you know, and as somebody who's published scholarly work, I know that sometimes peer review is really, really good. It's like the girl with the curl, right? When it's good, it's really, really good, and when it's bad, it's awful. I've had both experiences. We've seen these peer review rings that now a lot of journals say suggest your peer reviewers. As more and more journals get more specialized and technical, the editors who work for Elsevier don't know these subjects. So you get the opportunity to suggest your peer reviewers. And there was recently a ring of 30 or 60 scholars who had all agreed to review each other's journals or each other's articles. And they just suggested each other, and they churned out positive reviews, and more articles got published.
Well, I can tell you that I worked in scholarly publishing in the early 90s, and it was going on then.
Yeah, so that's
It was on our forum, like, do you have peer reviewers you would like to see?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, the system is easily gamed in a lot of different ways. One thing that open access, we've seen these so-called predatory open access journals that purport to do peer review and don't. Of course, they're not all open access. We've focused on open access journals. Of course, there are paid journals. Librarians here could mention a few presses that we've known for years are unreliable. If you do, the owner of one of them will threaten to sue you because he does. There's one of these presses that's owned by an individual, and suggestions that it's not a reputable publishing house have led to threats of defamation lawsuits. So, you know, this has existed in the subscription world as well. Yes, sir.
Are there any real indications that Congress is considering updating the copyright law?
They have held hearings that have been largely dominated by the traditional interests, the people who produce movies, music, and books, and much less representation from users, from scholars, from the folks who are innovating new ways to communicate content. But yes, they've talked about it quite seriously. They've held these hearings. You know, I have a little bit of doubt that in its current state, and especially in the current political environment, Congress could get its act together. It took almost 30 years to rewrite the copyright law that was eventually passed in 1976. And that, by the way, the New York Times wrote a story when President Gerald Ford signed the bill that became the current Copyright Act, that included in its headline, ho-hum, because copyright wasn't interesting to anybody then. So it would be a lot more conflicted now than it was, and it took 30 years then. So I have my doubts that we should look for Congress to actually make progress, but they certainly are talking about it. What I'm concerned about is that we will see incremental changes that are suggested and serve the interests of the lobbyists for the content industry. So one thing that we're seeing a lot of is, I've said that the remedies, the penalties, the remedies for copyright infringement should be more graduated. But what we're seeing is the lobbyists pushing for them to be constantly increased, more and more, mostly so they can make those threats at the beginning of a DVD that much more draconian. we're seeing efforts to move more and more enforcement onto the government. Copyright is a civil wrong. If this gentleman infringes my copyright, my remedy is to sue him. I'm the plaintiff, he's the defendant. Sorry about that, sir. But now the content industries are asking the government to get involved in enforcement more and more by defining more, by doing more investigation, by regulating things like the ability to get a domain or to get a domain seized, and often by criminalizing more infringement activity so that it will be prosecuted by the government rather than individuals. So we're seeing an attempt to shift the cost of copyright infringement onto the government. I'm afraid we'll see more of that without seeing a major reform. I'm not optimistic that Congress could do or would do a good job if they reformed Congress, or if they reformed copyright, or if they reformed Congress. But yes?
Would you go back to the discussion around the behavior of dogs, that piece of scholarly research?
I have the excitable dog who needs me to
Excitable dog,
speak
right.
very calmly to him.
The piece of that I'm finding really interesting, I'm looking at whether or not you had to do some supporting structure for it. The fact that when your university communications decides to feature a piece of research, you then ask the author to deposit it into the
Right.
repository so you can make it available free of charge through that model.
Right.
Did your faculty senate have to adopt any sort of open access policy that allows your faculty member who is publishing say, if asked, I have to deposit it into my
Right.
institutional repository?
In fact, they did.
Okay.
They did adopt such a policy. I don't believe they need to. Because when we do this, and almost all the time when we're implementing our open access policy, even though it gives us a license that is prior to the transfer of copyright to the publishers, that I believe continues to exist after the transfer of copyright to a publisher, even though we have that license and could basically say we're going to ignore your policies, we do not do that. We do not do that because we do not want to put our faculty in a position where they have conflicting obligations and are potentially in breach of contract, even though there wouldn't be a copyright infringement issue. Now we can deal with the breach of contract potential by making sure that publishers know that this license is there. But even without this, so anyway, in order to avoid that situation, we are always looking at what the actual journal policies are for published articles that our faculty want to put in the repository. So when we ask for these, we've already found out. So we say, sometimes we say back to News and Communications, we can't do this. It's a Nature publication, it can't be made available for 6 months, which is usually too long for this to do any good. Or we go to the faculty member and say, we've determined that we can do this with your final published, or your final manuscript. Would you please send that to us? We get really good response rates then and almost never any other time when we ask for final manuscripts. Or we go back and say, they allow us to download the published version. That's what we're going to do. Tell us if you have any objections. They never do. So we actually use those policies and make sure that we've followed them so that the faculty member has every incentive to say yes and very little to say no. Sure. Yes, sir.
Do you have any advice for the librarians who work to negotiate these licenses in terms of, say, allowing for refunds or paying back for open access articles that are published, and in terms of, say, making sure fair use isn't infringed upon in the contract, or making sure that it does allow for that right to deposit in an IR?
Right. I think you've just given the advice that I would give, is to negotiate for those points. That could either be a very long or a very short discussion. I'm going to make it a short discussion by saying that the major advice that I have is that librarians have put themselves in an incredibly difficult negotiating position for so long because everybody has known that we won't say no, that we will not walk away from a deal. We really need to stop doing that. Sometimes I think, I hear all the time, well, we had to sign that because our faculty needs it. But I often think we're not doing a good enough job of actually engaging our faculty. Sometimes, I don't know about you, but we have all the big packages. So when we're negotiating a new deal, sometimes it's with Elsevier or Wiley. We do that every 3 years or something. But a lot of the time, it's for something really pretty niche. And if we actually said, okay, who needs this? It might end up to be 1 or 2 faculty members, and you might very well be able to find alternative ways to find the material they need for their research. So I think we need to be more creative in thinking about how we meet faculty needs, especially as more and more stuff is becoming openly accessible. And we need to be willing to walk away. And we need to make sure that, in negotiation courses and such, they tell you to have your BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. What are you going to do if the negotiation fails? We don't do that in libraries, and I think that's what we need to do. We need to think about our BATNA. It's a terrible acronym. I think we're over time, so.
Then we should absolutely thank you for traveling here, for talking with us.
For staying awake. Thank you so much for your invitation and for the great questions.